So we've now seen how to add constraints using the Add Missing Constraints option. We've also taken a look at where we can find the constraints to view their details and make some changes. But what about deleting constraints or removing them? There's several ways to do this. One is that you can click over here and select one and hit delete, and it goes away. Now you'll notice in our live preview, our red window disappeared. Now we'll fix that shortly, but the important thing to remember is now we're missing some of the information that it needs to know the size and the location. So it probably did what we mentioned before, where it's going to a size of 0 in one or both dimensions. So let's go ahead and undo that. All right, so we've got all 4 of our constraints back. So that's one way to delete constraints. Just select it over here and hit delete. But you'll also notice that when this is selected, there was an option that we didn't look at earlier over here in the inspector. And that's this installed checkbox. So what does this do? So right now it's active. What if we uncheck it? Interesting. So we still have the constraint. It's still here. The information is still present, but the things disappeared from our screen. And you'll notice over here, if we click off of that, that it's actually grayed out now. So this is a really useful option for when you're maybe playing with some different ideas of how to do something, but you're not really sure yet which way you want to go about it or whether or not you need a constraint that you're using. So what the installed button does is it says, don't get rid of the constraint, but just show me what would happen if you're using all the other constraints but this one, or rather all the other constraints except for the ones that aren't installed. So it just means don't use this constraint. If we add it back, everything comes back just the way we had it before. So this is a really great non-destructive option for playing with whether or not you need a certain constraint. Now there was one other place that we saw our constraints, and that was when we were selected on the view. There we go, in this view here. So we've got the 4 of them over here. So is there a way to delete it from here? If I click on it once, and then let's try delete again. Okay, so it actually looks like what that does is it uninstalls things. Again, this is our non-destructive method. It graded out both in here and over here. So we haven't lost it. It just is another way of unchecking the install button. So in order to reactivate it again, we'll just double click into it and add the check mark back. So what should we do with these newfound powers? Felt a little bit like cheating before when we just hit that one button and got all these constraints. So let's see how to do the same thing from scratch. So we'll just select them all and hit delete. Interesting. Usually when we were deleting one constraint at a time, it was making the views disappear from our preview panel, but that's not happening now. The reason for this is that when there are no constraints at all, Auto Layout tries to guess based on what the actual view here looks like. So you can see that it's preserving the size and shape of our view this time, as opposed to the distance from the edges of the screen. We've got this same ratio rectangle here that we have on our iPad. And here on the iPhone 4, it's getting cut off, but you can see they both have that same spacing to the top. So you get kind of a sense of what Auto Layout prioritizes when it's making guesses, when it doesn't have enough information. It says, okay, well, you've got it here, and it's this size. So it's prioritizing the height and width of the object, as well as the X position and Y position of this upper corner. Remember, the origin in these situations is in this upper left corner, not in the bottom. So we can see we've got that same distance here in both of the previews. So that's a good tip, a good thing to look out for when you see a little bit of unexpected behavior. It might be because Auto Layout is guessing and sort of combining your constraints with what it sees on the screen. But we always want to have as many constraints as it takes to tell Auto Layout exactly what we want. So let's get started. So now, how do we add constraints manually, one at a time? There are several different ways. The first way that I'll show you is the control drag method. This allows for us to quickly select, and apply constraints between two objects in Interface Builder. So what you want to do is choosing one of the objects that you want to apply the constraint to. Remember, we need two of them. So let's choose the object that we want to start applying constraints to. So with our cursor over the object that we want to apply constraint to, we want to hold down Control and click. And then once we drag, we'll get this new bar. And we can release Control now. You don't have to hold it down. As long as you're holding your mouse button down, you can move it around. And you can see that we've sort of got a blue highlighted box around the view that we're over. And it says View down in the bottom corner. Now, what else can we drag this to? Oh, okay, so it looks like we can drag it to the super view. This is the main window that everything inside of this view controller scene must be a child of, must belong to. So we've got these two options. So another interesting thing about this is that it's smart, and depending on where you release will determine which options you're given. So let's go ahead and drag it down to the bottom view and then release. And we get this little pop-up menu. It says bottom space to bottom layout guide, center horizontally, equal widths, equal heights, aspect ratio. Okay, well, let's not select any yet. Let's see what some other options are. So let's Control, click, and drag to the side, and then release. And you can see now we're getting different options. Leading space to container margin, top space to top layout guide, center horizontally, center vertically. So what it's doing is, based on the direction you drag, it's trying to guess which kinds of constraints you're applying. And it sort of makes sense. If we drag from this view to the side, we're probably trying to apply a constraint that affects this edge or something to do with how it's positioned in this way, such as centering it horizontally. Whereas when we drag down, then it was trying to give us options for applying rules to the bottom edge. And we can also see we've got things like equal widths, equal heights, and aspect ratio. And it's also got some tips down here for holding Option for alternatives, and that changes up here what our options are, as well as holding Shift if we want to select multiples at the same time, and we get these little check marks. So this is what happens when we Control drag to the super view. But what happens if we just do this? Okay, so we still get some options: width, height, and aspect ratio. Now this is interesting, and for some people it's a little counterintuitive, but it kind of makes sense. You can apply a constraint from an object to itself just to tell it things that have nothing to do with other objects. So aspect ratio, for instance, is the ratio between the width and the height. So if we wanted a square, we would say 1 to 1. Or if we want it to be twice as tall as it is wide, then it could be 2 to 1 or 1 to 2, and so on. But remember, our original goal is, let's just get back to where we were before, where it looks like a square in this view, but over here it'll be a rectangle that just has a consistent border around the edges. So let's add in that top border. So let's Control drag from our red view to the parent view. Well, actually, you know what? They're both labeled view, but there's something we can do about that. Let's just go ahead and undo that. Let's go over here and click once, and then pause, and then click again. It's not quite a double click. And let's just call this the super view, because that's what it is. And then here, we'll just change this to say red. It'll be very clear now what we're talking about. Now if we come back over here and do our Control drag again. Okay, great. So now it says red, and now that says super view. And then let's add in this top space to the top layout guide. Great. So we got our one constraint over here, and we can see that it added in our constraints over here. If we spread it out, oh nice. So we can see that depending on the name of our views over here, it actually reflects that right here. So we're going from red to not quite the super view, because again, like I said, it defaults to going to the top layout guide. So let's click on that. And again, we can see over here, red, top layout guide. And another thing you'll notice is that once we added this one constraint, the preview changed. Again, like I said before, when there are no constraints, it defaults to matching those 4 attributes: height, width, X position, Y position. But as soon as we add one constraint, it's no longer sure what you want. It doesn't have quite enough information. So it's doing something here, and it looks like the spacing from the top of our view to the top layout guide is correct, but other than that, it's not really sure what it is that we want. You'll also notice it looks different in both views. So let's actually run it this time and see what it presents us in the simulator. Interesting. So here we see a hybrid approach where it's respecting the boundary that we set to the top, but it's still trying to match those other aspects. But that's not happening in preview. And this is the situation that I was talking about before, where when it doesn't quite have all the information, it guesses, but it doesn't always guess consistently or in a way that you would expect. And that's not its fault, that's our fault. We haven't told it enough information. So let's stop the simulator and look at this a little bit more. So we've got one constraint, and we've seen something different in both of these previews and in the simulator. Now I want to show you something even more interesting. So we've got our one constraint selected. Let's go over here and click uninstall. Now, what would you expect? You would probably expect that when we click uninstall, it will act as if we had no constraints again, and that these will return to matching the size and shape of this. But that's not what happens. So the interesting thing is that it made that guess before we had any constraints. But then we added a constraint, but then just turned it off. So it's not really sure yet whether it should still consider that we have a constraint that we're not technically using, or if it should ignore it altogether. And so it has to make educated guesses. The thing about that is this is similar to the situation where we got a view that had a width of 0. Technically, if the view has a height or width of 0, or if it's positioned off screen, it satisfies all the constraints that we have. Because we don't have any constraints, the view can literally be anywhere and satisfy the 0 constraints that we have. So let's install it again. And now the other one has disappeared. So we're in a similar situation where every time we click install or uninstall, it's recalculating based on the information it has. And it either has one constraint or no constraints. So it's basically just trying different things. So if you click install, uninstall multiple times, you'll see that it just keeps changing. So you may notice that up here, we've got this little warning sign, but also over here, we've now got this little red arrow. So let's click on that. Okay, so this takes us in here. Okay, so it looks like it's showing us missing constraints and misplaced views. So what does it say? Okay, so it needs constraints for the X position and the width and for the height. So remember, those are the 4 attributes that it needs to know. And it doesn't always have to be told explicitly these attributes, but it has to be able to calculate what these attributes are based on our other constraints. But right now, all we've told it is how high our view is. So it has our Y position. So it's not asking for that, but it does need these other 3 things. And then down here, we've got misplaced views. This is just a warning, letting us know that the constraints that we have don't match with what we see in here. And it also gives you a little bit more information. It says it expected it to be at X equals 0 with a height and a width of 0. So this is telling you that this is one of the ways that it's calculated it. And that explains why over here on the iPhone 4.7 inch, it's just not showing because it's treating it like it has a height and a width of 0. But what we actually have on this screen is that it's got, a width over 500 and a height over 400. So we need to make sure that we get our constraints back in alignment with what we actually want it to be. So let's click back over here. So basically, anytime you see this little red arrow, that's an indicator that you're not going to get consistent results, both in preview and in the simulator. So let's add those extra constraints that we need. Now, we can also stay in this view over here so that we can watch and remind ourselves of which constraints we need to add. So let's go ahead and add one for our X position. Let's come over here and we'll Control, click, and drag over to the super view. And then we'll release, and let's see. So we want the leading space to the container margin. Let's go ahead and assign that. Now you'll notice it's not asking us for values. So what it's defaulting to is it's using the value that's currently on the screen. But we want it to be the same all the way around. what's on the screen. And that's fine for just getting the constraint in place because, as we know, we can edit those values later to get it where we want. But for now, let's just go ahead and add some constraints so that auto layout is happy and we get rid of our warnings. We can already see we've gotten rid of one of them. So now we just need one for the height and one for the width. Now this will be a good time to take a moment and show you the other ways that we have of adding constraints. So we've done two now with a control, click, and drag. But now let's use the pin menu down here. So we've got the alignment menu and the pin menu, but we want to use the pin menu. So let's click on that. Now it's important to note that you want to make sure that you're selected on the view that you want to add it to. If we were not selected and we try to open the menu, there's like no option because we haven't given it an object for it to form a relationship. So let's make sure we select that view. We'll come here to the pin menu. So we need to tell it the height and the width. So those options are right here, but last time we actually told it that we wanted to be centered horizontally and vertically. And we don't really see that here. So let's check and see. That's actually in the alignment menu. Here we go. Horizontally center in container and vertically center in container. So let's go ahead and activate those. And down here you'll notice that now it says add two constraints. So if you forgot to check them, then you wouldn't be able to add anything. So we'll go ahead and check them. And you'll also see down here that there's this update frames option. You can say items of new constraints or all frames in container. And if you remember when we did the update frames option before from this third menu here, what that did was it moved the view here to match with our constraints, to get rid of those dotted lines. Now you might think that that's a good idea, and sometimes it is, but you want to be careful because if you're in the middle of adding a bunch of constraints, but you haven't added all of the constraints, if you update the frames in your container, remember that if auto layout thinks that your height or your width is 0 or that your position should be somewhere off screen, it's going to move your views. So I tend to stick with none, and then I will manually update the frames once I'm ready. So I'm going ahead and add these two constraints. Great, and now we can see in our preview over here that we're almost back to where we were before. The spacing isn't quite right, so that means that we probably don't have the right values or the same values that we had before. But all of our errors have gone away. Now auto layout is happy, it knows what to do. And if we run it in the simulator, we should see a consistent result with what's in our preview. Great, so let's go ahead and stop that.